more people are trickling in. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure, we have Dr. Ronald Banks today. He is an evaluator on the 730 panel and has also done some bonding studies for us. So he does have quite a bit of experience with the dependency system, in particular issues of bias that are implicit therein, and that's what he's going to be talking to us about today. So,
thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Amy mentioned, my name is Ronald Banks. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my experience in working in dependency court goes back to 1995 when I was an intern at Children's Institute Incorporated. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Children's Institute. And as an intern, I was given the opportunity to work with Dr. Herschel Swinger, who developed Project Fatherhood. So I kind of came in on the ground floor when that project was being developed, and I always said, I love jazz music, so I always said I was like a young jazz lion coming in to work with a jazz veteran who was Dr. Swinger. Does anyone in here know Dr. Swinger? Yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry. I still speak about him as if he's alive today, because I often hear his voice when I'm doing presentations. He taught me a lot. I worked with Dr. Swinger from '95 until his death in 2011. So I do a lot of work, as Amy mentioned, with dependency court. I do a lot of 730 evaluations, and so I have some experience in doing that. So today's presentation is on elimination of bias. So what we're going to be doing is talking about really implicit bias. Let me just give a definition of implicit bias. Implicit bias is the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. Again, it's an unconscious attribution, so we apply these attributes to a member of a particular social group. Now, a lot of folks really hate doing implicit bias training for a number of reasons. One, some people don't believe in implicit bias. It doesn't work. It's pseudoscience. Two, over time, if you're not retraining and you're not extending the training through the year, people just tend to forget about it. And three, which I think is probably the biggest one, people don't want to be perceived as being racist. They don't want to be perceived as discriminating against anyone. And oftentimes, if you are doing a training and this isn't expressed up front, people's feelings can get hurt in an implicit bias training. So my goal today is not to point the finger at anyone. Hopefully, this will be done with sensitivity so people will not feel as if they are being targeted by me or anyone else in the group. Everybody has implicit bias. We all do. Everybody has prejudices. We all do. So there's no group that is excluded from having implicit bias or prejudices. So let's talk about, also I was mentioning to Amy earlier that normally this training is a 3 to 6 hour training. So we've only got an hour or so today, so I have condensed over 100 slides to about 50 or so. So this is going to be real quick. I'm not going to have time to answer a lot of questions. I don't want to inhibit anyone from asking questions. I don't mean to give that message. But it's going to be real quick snapshots. So I hope that even though there's some brevity to this, people will get something out of it. Okay. And Amy told me that you all keep the presentation, so if you need to go back over some of this, hopefully you can. So we're going to be looking at the intersection of mental health, cultural beliefs, maybe issues about psychotropic medication, corporal punishment, gender identity, different stereotypes about what certain cultural ethnicities believe about therapy. We're going to be looking at all of those and relevant issues and how implicit bias factors into this. We're going to be doing it from the aspect of social psychology. Another reason that some implicit bias trainings aren't as productive or people don't really enjoy them is there's not a lot of science behind it. So with social psychology, we're looking at how people deal with social interactions, their origins, and the effect on the individual or the group. That's what social psychology looks at. So we're going to take a scientific approach. We're going to take a look at how prejudice works, and hopefully we'll have a better understanding of implicit bias. Learning objectives for today. Number one, I want hopefully everyone will be able to increase their awareness and sensitivity to help deal with diverse clients. You guys deal with clients of different ethnicities, different geographical locations, people that are immigrants to this country. You deal with people from various socioeconomic groups. You deal with people who maybe have some gender-related issues, ageism, so you have a lot of different groups that you work with. But we're going to try to understand terms like stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Often, most of the time, I think these three words are used interchangeably, but they're all very, very different. We're going to learn what social psychology has to say about diversity and unconscious bias. And lastly, we're going to learn strategies to help reduce implicit bias, and hopefully you can apply that not only to your job as dependency court lawyers, but also in your everyday life on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to cover, as I said quickly, 6 different sections. 1, definitions, the definitions between stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. 2, the effects that stereotypes have on a people or a group. 3, stereotype threat theory. 4, social identity theory. 5, the benefits of diversity, because there's a lot of scientific evidence to show that diversity does benefit groups, people, corporations, occupations, you name it. And 5, best practices. What can we do, what can you do, what can all of us do to decrease prejudice, not only amongst ourselves, but amongst, well, typically amongst ourselves. That's what we want to do. So, what are stereotypes? Stereotypes are beliefs that we hold about the attributes or characteristics of other groups likely to have. So stereotypes are based on basically culture and society. So what does culture and society say about certain groups of people? You may not believe the stereotypes, but we've all heard of stereotypes. You see it in the media, you see it in social media, you'll see a lot of stereotypes when people, what is it called, memes? Mm-hmm. Okay, memes often have stereotypes. I think most memes are kind of stereotypical. Would that be a fair thing to say? Mm-hmm. A lot of them. So we see stereotypes all over. It doesn't mean we believe them. It just means that we're very aware of stereotypes that exist. So when I walked into this room and you heard I was a psychologist, I'm sure many of you immediately had a stereotype about a psychologist. Just as society, and I know you all know this, society has stereotypes about attorneys, right? Right? Okay. So, what was that? Oh, I thought somebody said something. I'm sorry. Were you sticking up for attorneys?
No, I said we had stereotypes about attorneys, and I said, and they're all wrong, but I said it under my breath, which obviously was louder than I said.
You know what? I like a lot of participation, so that was okay. So let's talk about certain stereotypes. Can anybody name any stereotypes? And remember, we're not saying we believe these. We're just saying we are aware of them. Yes.
Old women are prone to having too many cats.
Okay.
Asians are smart.
Asians are smart? Okay. What else?
Irish people like to drink.
Okay. Any more?
White men can't jump.
Okay. Okay. So, those are some good examples. So, we have racial stereotypes. We have stereotypes about African Americans. We have stereotypes about men and women. Someone just mentioned old women have a lot of cats. We have stereotypes about disabled, about different sexual orientations, about socioeconomic status. If you have a client that is a white mother who comes from Palmdale or Lancaster, what stereotype do you think is popular about that particular?
Too many kids and methamphetamine.
Meth is a big stereotype. Anybody else?
Sexual abuse thrown in.
Okay.
Don't be dismissing my clients.
What about a father who comes in with tattoos and gold chains around his neck?
Gang member.
Gang member? What?
Felon.
Felon? What was the one somebody laughed
I
at?
said very artistic.
Okay, yes, a unique perspective. You have to speak up a little bit. Okay, so those are common stereotypes. I'm sorry, Lancaster and Palmdale, I didn't mean any harm. So, in summary, stereotypes apply to the whole group, the entire group. They're largely products of culture and society. We see them in current events, we see it in social media, we see it in all kinds of media, we see it among people we meet. And we learn it through other people, and we tend, even though we don't believe in the stereotype, we tend to agree that those certain stereotypes exist. So, let's move on to prejudice. What is prejudice? Prejudice are negative feelings people have about other groups. They're attitudinal, they're evaluative, and overall, prejudices basically have a negative reaction. It's just covered in negativity. Oftentimes, prejudice can take on subtle forms. It can be aversive, it can be ambivalent. Ambivalent prejudice can be having positive and negative feelings about a certain group, which sometimes brings up cognitive dissonance. And if you have cognitive dissonance and you have one belief that kind of challenges the other, it creates a little stress and anxiety. So what you do, you go to the belief that can lower those tensions and anxieties. So that's ambivalent prejudice. Again, implicit. It can be very implicit. We talked about that. But it's got an affective quality. It has an emotional quality. It's evaluative, and it's an attitude. So prejudice, this is kind of tricky. Prejudice is not about what we believe, okay? But we specifically dislike someone or something from a particular group. So if you ask somebody if they were prejudiced, they would say, no, I'm not prejudiced. And then you prod them a little bit and you throw some things out there. Well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Well, this group might be like that, but what about this? What about, yeah, that's exactly how that group is, and I don't like that group. That's prejudice. Discrimination. Discrimination is how we treat other people. So what people do, the behaviors they exhibit, the choices they make based on being able to yield power. So, through discrimination, and I think we all know this, we treat one group better than another based on whether or not that group is an in-group or an out-group. So if someone is applying for a job and they're more like us, if we are prone to discriminate, we may hire the person who is more like us, even though the person from the out-group may have more qualities that are commensurate for that job. We'll get into some research in just a little bit. So discrimination can happen unconsciously, and controlling for all factors, what it comes down to is a preference or influence of the in-group based dynamics. It's someone like you, someone from the in-group, as opposed to someone unlike you who would be in the out-group. So, let's move on to section 2. Any questions on prejudice, discrimination, or stereotypes? Okay, let's move on to section 2. We're going to talk about the stereotype effects on perception and evaluation. I'm going to cite, what I'm going to try to do is cite at least one study if I can, and hit 3 bullet points, and then move on to the next one. So, in general, we know that stereotypes lead to biases, especially when our information that we have is spotty at best. It's very unclear, it's very ambiguous. So I'm going to give the example of the doctor riddle. Now, if you've heard this riddle before, and I assume most of you have, I want you to not give the answer away. But here it goes. A father and his son are on their way to a baseball game. While they're driving to the baseball game, all of a sudden out of nowhere, a train comes, boom, obliterates the car. The father dies, the boy is badly injured. The boy is rushed to the hospital, he's in the operating room, and the doctor walks in. There's major work that needs to be done on this boy. The doctor takes one look at the boy, looks down and says, I can't operate on this boy. This boy is my son. What's that about? I mean, if you know the answer, don't say it. Anybody who has not heard this before? Okay. Those of you who raised your hand, can you tell me what's at play here? What's the answer to that question? I can't operate on this boy. This boy is my son.
He's the same race.
Same race?
Oh, no.
Mothers? I don't know what.
Who said that? What'd you say?
The mother.
It's the mother. So our own bias views doctors as mainly a male-oriented profession. That's how we're influenced in society. So we had very little information to go on, but we just assumed that the doctor was the father. But how could it be the father? The father just got killed. So that's an example of stereotype effect. That's how it affects our perception. Okay, let's talk about how we evaluate when we have stereotype effect. Here's an example. Darley and Gross, some social psychologists, did a study in 1983. And in this study, they had a picture of a young girl. I think she was around 7 or 8 years old. Excuse me, it wasn't a picture, it was a video. And in this video, this little girl was answering questions, like the teacher was asking her questions and she was answering. Sometimes the answers were right, sometimes the answers were wrong, but she's answering. They asked the group of participants to determine what is the intelligence level of this girl. Sometimes they would pair the picture of the video of the girl with an affluent neighborhood. And when they paired the video of the girl answering questions, whether she got them right or wrong, with the affluent neighborhood, they assigned a level of intelligence to her that was very high. This must be a really, really smart girl. And if she's missing these answers, it's not because she's not smart. It's because they gave her some really, really difficult questions. But she's really smart, I can tell. When they showed the same girl in the video and they paired it with a picture of a rundown neighborhood, you know, a very low socioeconomic neighborhood, they asked the participants, what do you think about the intelligence of this girl? Well, she's not very smart. Not very smart. She's missing some real easy questions, too. Now, same people thought she was very bright and she was missing some of the questions. So that's an evaluation. You base your evaluation on the information that you have. That's a stereotype effect. So they guide how we understand people and their actions, and oftentimes, as it guides us in the wrong direction. We completely miss what's really going on. So, outgroup homogeneity is an effect that overestimates the similarity to one another. And you end up applying the stereotypes really, really broadly to an outgroup. In other words, it's the group that's not yours. And oftentimes, because there's a lack of variance, those stereotypes stick. So they lead to biases, as I mentioned, when things are unclear or ambiguous. And in a few moments, I'm going to ask folks about an in-group that they belong to, and I'm going to ask you your opinion of the competing outgroup. Stereotype threat, section 3. Stereotype threat theory says that sometimes stereotypes about the groups we belong to can dictate or determine how we feel about ourselves if we're a member of that stereotype group. So there's a fear of confirming the stereotype of your group, and fearing the stereotype of that group could unintentionally cause a person to act in accordance with that stereotype. So here's a couple of examples. There is a senator, African-American senator from Texas. His name is Rodney Ellis. He says, I knew I was just as intelligent as everyone else. For some reason, I didn't score well on tests. Maybe I was just nervous. There's a lot of pressure on you knowing that if you fail your race. Stereotype 3. A second example, from Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'm sure everybody knows him. Yeah? Okay. Who doesn't know him? Okay, he's a scientist, got his own TV show. He's like a superstar, a rock star scientist, African American. Neil deGrasse Tyson says, in the perception of society, my athletic talents are genetic. I was just born to be athletic. I didn't have to work at anything. I'm a likely mugger/rapist. My academic failures are expected, and my academic successes are attributed to others. to spend most of my life fighting these attitudes levies an emotional tax that is a form of intellectual emasculation. Those are some really, if you think about that, those are some really stunning words. I had my own experience of stereotype threat. When you all go to take the bar exam, where is it? Is it held at a hotel?
Convention center usually.
Okay. Century City?
Convention center
Convention
usually.
center, okay. When I went to take my license to become a psychologist in 2001, I was in the area where everybody signs in, and they have the what do they call them, proctors, I guess. And so you go to where your name is, and you pull your card and so forth, and you're entered in. And everybody was walking around and talking nervously. Oh, I'm gonna fail this test. I'm not ready. I don't like being around a lot of nervousness. So I said, I'm gonna go to the other side of the hotel in a quiet area, and I'm just gonna chill over there. After about an hour, it was time for the test, so I came back. So all of the proctors are elderly, retired Caucasian people. As I walked through the door, the woman at the door stopped me, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm here to take the psychology test." And I said, "I'm here to take the test." She said, "This is a psychology test." I said, "I know, that's why I'm here." She said, "This is a psychology test." I said, "I know, that's why I'm here." She said, "This is a psychology test. I don't recognize you." I said, "There's 400 people here. Do you recognize all 400 people?" Finally, I said, "I can act a fool," which she might be expecting me to do. I can educate her, or I can ignore it. I chose to ignore it. I went in and took the test, failed my first attempt. Now, I told myself initially I failed because I didn't study hard enough. But the more I thought about it, I'm wondering how much stereotype threat had to do with it, because I thought about that the entire time, 5 or 6 hours I was in there taking the test. So stereotype threat could have been happening at that time. This woman was basing my appearance, her stereotype was based on my appearance. So it was an unconscious bias, but it was a bias just the same. All right, so a couple of, well, at least one study by Steele and Aronson in '95 on an example of stereotype threat. Yes, sir?
Were you the only black person there?
There was one other, and I knew it because I happened to know him, and I knew he was going to be there. So I should have been easily identifiable, right? Okay. So in this situation, this study, they had black and white students answering SAT questions. Now, it wasn't a real SAT test. They were just answering SAT questions, okay? There were two conditions. The first condition, there were no instructions given. This is, we're going to ask you some questions. Let's see how you do. The second condition, they were told, this is a test that measures general intelligence. So what do you think happened? Stereotype threat. When it was not a test of intelligence, there was no difference in the scores between the black and white students. When the black students heard that this is a test of intelligence, they markedly underperformed compared to the white students. And they had done just as well previously. So that's a study from '95. And then there's thousands and thousands of studies, but that's just one particular study. So there are 4 main conditions that occur that make it fertile for stereotype threat. One is that group members of that stereotype group, they're aware of the negative stereotype about their group. And it becomes even more pronounced if they're made aware of it just before the scenario or the test or whatever the case may be. If they're reminded of it just before, stereotype threat is more potent. Number 2, the task is diagnostic of the stereotyped ability. Does everybody know what an abacus is? How do you describe them? There's little beads that you slide along the railings. There's several rows. So an abacus is used for math, right? Who in here thinks they're really good at math? Okay. Amy says she's really good at math. Amy, could you do a math problem on an abacus?
No.
Okay, so that is not a diagnostic test of math. That doesn't determine math ability. But if she was given a calculus problem or a geometry problem or something like that, she could probably do pretty well. So stereotype threat has to exist if the task is diagnostic of the particular ability that they're looking at. The third condition for stereotype threat is the task has to be difficult or challenging. So if you feel like it's a really easy task, even though you may be a member of that stereotype group, stereotype threat will have a much less of an impact on you. And for stereotype threat to have an impact, the person has to really care about their own group. For instance, Rodney Ellis, who talked about carrying the weight of his race on his shoulders, and the task involved. So you really want to pass that bar exam. I really want to pass that psychology exam. It has to be a task that you really care about, and you really care about your group. There was a meta-analysis in 2015 by Walton, Murphy, and Ryan, and in over 400 studies, they found that stereotype threat can cause people to underperform relative to their ability. That's a lot of research studies to illustrate that theory. Okay, other ways to reduce stereotype threat. Something called the Obama effect. This was a study done in 2009 while President Obama was running for president. It was by Marx, Cohen, and Friedman. And what they did was they asked two groups of students. One group was white. And I'm sorry, as I'm talking about these studies, try to think about folks that you work with that have different ethnicities, or there's some sort of stereotype, similar to folks I mentioned earlier. So there was a verbal test given to black and white students. The verbal test was given on 3 separate occasions. One, when Barack Obama was running for president. When he was running for president, there was not much difference. There was a disparity between the black students and the white students. The black students were usually lower. When he was actually running for president and when he won the nomination for the Democratic Party, they took the test again. The scores increased for the black students. When he won the presidency, the scores increased dramatically, 3 different occasions. The control group, the scores basically stayed the same. So that's an example, another example of having a role model. So if you can think of a role model that you can look up to, that is a member of your social group, and you can really think about the strides and accomplishments of that person or persons, it can take away the stereotype threat, or at least decrease it. Another is a mindset change. So oftentimes people believe that intelligence doesn't change, that once we reach a certain age, say 25 or so, our intelligence is set, and we can't increase intelligence. But there are others who in neuroscience is showing now that intelligence is not necessarily fixed, it can be changeable. So here's a study from 2003, and they had 2 groups of 7th grade students. They were males and females. So they took the 2 groups, and one group was told, your intelligence will never change, it stays the same. The second group were told, intelligence is malleable, you can increase your intelligence, all you have to do is work at it. At the end of the semester, what they found was the students who were told that intelligence doesn't change, and now I'm talking about the difference between gender, males and females. The female scores there was quite a disparity. Their scores were so much lower than the boys. In the group that was given the mindset idea and told, you can increase your intelligence, the girls' scores increased dramatically, and they were equal or greater than the boys' scores. So if you're given a mindset that you can improve in this, that, or the other area, you can erase or greatly reduce stereotype threat. The third thing to reduce stereotype threat is called self-affirmation. So you're reminding yourself of other important values. So you're not just focusing on the stereotype against your group, but you're broadening your perspective a little bit. So in broadening your perspective, it decreases the threat. So here's an example of an affirmation. Music is important to me because it gives me a way to express myself when I'm mad, happy, or sad. I also think family and friends are important because everything like money, fame, happiness mean nothing if you don't have loved ones to share it with. So, self-affirmations, if you have some self-affirmations, 1 or 2 or more, and you practice those on a regular basis, again, it can greatly reduce any disparity that may exist if you come from a stereotype group. It reduces that stereotype threat. And in review, the 3 things that reduce stereotype threat are role models, having that mindset that things can change or things can be better, and having self-affirmation, not just focusing on the one act or scenario or task at hand that has a negative stereotype against your group, but looking at life much broader and more holistic, and not just focusing on that and putting all your marbles in one basket. All right, we have a few minutes left. We have about 25 minutes left. Section 4, social identity theory. So, social identity theory was developed primarily by Todgefeld and Turner, and they said that social identity theory is the portion of an individual's self-concept derived from a perceived membership in a relevant social group. So with social identity theory, it says you get your self-worth from groups that you belong to and you bask in the reflective glory. So if you're a Laker fan, and when the Lakers win, you celebrate because you really identify with that group of being a Laker fan. I guess I should have used Clippers and been winning a lot more, right? You didn't score that last basket. You didn't hit that last jump shot. Like, who's the guy who hit the jump shot the other day from Toronto at the end of the game? Who?
Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah, Kawhi Leonard. You didn't hit that jumper like Kawhi Leonard did, but you identify with the Toronto Raptors. You identify with the Lakers, the Clippers, whomever. So you bask in that glory. So you share some of the recognition. Now, we divide between in-groups and out-groups. So we favor in-groups. So let me ask a question. We're in Los Angeles. You guys are attorneys. How many of you went to UCLA? Okay, it's about 6 of you. How many of you went to USC? Okay, much fewer. Does that mean anything? Okay.
That we're poor.
So let me ask the UCLA folks. Tell me what would you say if I asked you what is a UCLA alumni or student like? What would you say?
Well-rounded.
Well-rounded. What else? What else? Anybody else? Did I say UCLA? Come on, I'm not from here. I'm not from California, so I don't have a bias either way.
Socially aware?
Socially aware? Okay. All right. So UCLA grads, I'm sorry, USC? What did I say, UCLA first? Okay, USC grads, tell me some qualities of USC people.
Better.
One more.
Wealthy.
Wealthy, okay. Now, let's flip it back to UCLA folks. Tell me what USC people are like.
They bought their degrees.
Okay, USC folks, tell me about UCLA.
Better.
Did I say that right? I think I got it mixed up. But anyway, you can see that when you identify with your in-group, the contrast is you have favoritism for that group simply because you belong to that group and you can identify them. So you bask in that reflective glory. The contrast is out-group derogation. So you assign or you treat someone or something from a different group or the out-group as if they have no self-worth. So those are the dangers of really ascribing to the in-group and the in-group only. You know nothing about the out-group. If you haven't met people individually, you know nothing about them. Okay, so social identity theory asks, Can meaningless groups produce bias? What do you think?
Yes.
You heard my presentation before. So, a group of researchers, I believe it's the same researchers that I mentioned before, they developed the minimal group paradigm. So they created arbitrary and artificial outgroups. And here's how it worked. This is from 1971. They divided people into meaningless groups. Is anybody in here patrons of the arts? You really know artists? Okay, me neither. There's two artists. One is Klee, the other is Kandinsky. Klee and Kandinsky, they make abstract paintings. And if you put their two styles side by side and looked at them, you wouldn't be able to tell one from the other if you knew nothing about painting, right? So they divided people into two groups where they showed them two paintings. Which one do you prefer, Klee or Kandinsky? Klee people were put in one group, Kandinsky people were put in the other group. And there's really no difference between the images if you don't know art. They were then asked to distribute virtual money to the participants, to the other participants. Now, the only thing they knew about the other participants was they didn't know their name, but they had a code next to their, to identify them. And then the other feature of identity was whether they were a Klee person or a Kandinsky person, whether they liked Klee art or Kandinsky. And as you can imagine, people favored their own group in giving the fake money. They gave much more money to a Klee person if they themselves were a Klee person, much more money to a Kandinsky person if they were a Kandinsky person. So this highlights that even though prejudice is motivated by specific beliefs or specific thoughts that we have about another group, some of it just has to do with there being a group. And really it has no other significance at all, just being another group. Have you ever been in a training and you divide up into groups and you automatically become very competitive against the group? And you feel like you've known that group you're with for a long time, they feel like friends? That's an example of this effect, social identity theory. Let's talk about the benefits of diversity. This is section 5 of 6, we're almost done. I know you guys are just waiting to get back to court. We all know that this society is becoming increasingly diverse, and I think it's happening worldwide. Since we're in the United States, let's focus on the United States. And social psychology studies have shown that diversity can reduce prejudice. A 1996 study showed that people prefer to like their own groups when everybody's like them. We've talked about that before. But they found that diverse groups tend to perform better. So they did a lot of studies in corporate businesses, corporate companies. And why do diverse groups perform better? Because when a group is diverse, they have different ways of attacking an issue. So you have people maybe of different ages, gender, ethnicity, life experiences, so forth and so on. With all of those things, the creativity increases. Not only does the creativity increase when they say they're doing some brainstorming in a group, and they're focusing on a present situation, but because of the diversity, it also helps improve future problem solving. That's what diversity does. So working in group, just with people that are like you, does not produce good quality results. In fact, it produces poor results, and it's a result of groupthink. Because if you live with someone who's very much like you, you tend to succumb to the pressure. If the group is saying we want it this way and you want it another way, you're going to succumb to the pressure. An example I can think of in the law is if you are on a jury and say the majority of the jury is one in-group and you are all in the in-group. I don't know if this is a good example or not, but you may have a difference of opinion on deciding guilt or innocence or the outcome of a trial than the rest of the group. But because it's in group, you eventually give in and you vote with everyone else. So we know that diversity-related issues are presenting challenges to the majority culture. A lot of people have a lot of fear about immigrants coming into the country. We know that in California, I think by the year 2030 or so, the minority, the Latino community, will be the majority in California. I think that's fairly accurate. So, Craig and Richson did a study in 2014, and they talked to the folks that were of the majority. And what they found was there was a perceived racial shift. So because there is a shift in diversity in the population, what it produced was negative out-group attitudes, number one. It produced a preference to interact with your own group. It generated a lot of anger and a lot of fear. It generated anxiety, and there was much less likely to want diversity, and they endorsed diversity much less. Now, why is that happening? Because they found out that the majority feels like their society is going to be threatened. These are folks who believe this. Not everybody believes this. But they believe that racial minorities are more likely to reduce the influence of white Americans in society. Now, when you reassure people through talking about the benefits of diversity, and you can prove through scientific evidence that diversity is much better, that shift changes and people don't respond to that threat, so there is no effect. That effect dissipates. One way that effect dissipates is you don't just focus on the minority or the soon-to-be majority, but you focus on everybody's attributes, everybody's qualities, everybody's skills, everybody's beliefs. So it's very inclusive rather than being exclusive, because with this effect, people believe that it excludes them. There are a couple of different practices in how to best approach diversity. One is colorblindness, the other is multiculturalism. So with colorblindness, people downplay a group or group differences. Everybody's the same. We just focus on similarities. I don't see color. With multiculturalism, you highlight group differences, you highlight group membership, and again, you focus on the differences. Those are just as important. So both of them share a common goal. They want to improve diversity. However, they're very different. An example of colorblindness would be an excerpt from Martin Luther King's speech. He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Now, if Martin Luther King was alive today, I think he still would say these types of things, but I think he may be shifting more towards multiculturalism. That's just my own personal opinion. But during those times, in the 50s and the 60s, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, that was the most important thing to gain inclusiveness. An example of multiculturalism would be Barack Obama. He stated, "For we know that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are shaped by every language and culture. We are drawn from every end of this earth." So an example of a multicultural ideology. So typically the majority endorses colorblindness according to the studies. The minority endorses multiculturalism. So if a person, nobody wants to be seen as racist. So if a person says, "I don't see race, I don't see color," that automatically means that person is not racist in their mind. It's well-intentioned. However, in another study by Summers and Norton in 2008, I believe they were at a corporation. I can't remember what the corporation did, but they interviewed people of color who worked in the corporation. And when they asked them about their white colleagues' beliefs, they said that the white colleagues who avoid mentioning race appeared to them to be more biased. They went on to say that when their white colleagues expressed the view or ideology of colorblindness, their white colleagues appeared to them to be more explicit and implicitly prejudiced. So it was more out there sometimes, it was more implicit other times. So a colorblind approach can be counterproductive according to the research, but one thing that dispels that is if you recognize the unique backgrounds of everyone. Okay, we're moving to and I'm sorry if I'm going through this so quickly, but we have to make time. Best practices, how to reduce, more about how to reduce, or how do we think about prejudice reduction. One way to reduce prejudice, a study was done, they showed education and training goes a long way towards reducing prejudice. So in one study, when they gave the implicit bias test, has anybody ever taken the implicit bias test? There are multiple implicit bias tests, multiple, covering every stereotype you can think of, every bias. Folks who took the implicit bias test, there were two groups. One received the results of their implicit bias test, so they got a sense of who they were in terms of their biases. They also were taught about the consequences of implicit bias. How does this affect society? How does this affect certain groups? The other group just took the test. They weren't made aware of their results. They weren't made aware of any concerns or how this plays out in society. Part two was training. The control group didn't receive any training. The study group received 5 bias reduction strategies, and we'll talk about those shortly. So there was a pre-test baseline. Again, the control group just took the test, nothing else. After 4 weeks, they took the test again. After 8 weeks, they took the test again. After the 4th week, the study group that received the intervention, they had a vastly reduced implicit bias score, while the control group had no increase. Week 8, the participants that took the intervention had a significantly lower bias test than the intervention group. So training and education goes a long way. Another way to reduce prejudice is something called contact theory by Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport was a psychologist who was prominent mostly in the 1950s, and he wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice. Excuse me. And contact theory is really, really simple. It simply says if you bring groups together, that should help reduce prejudice. So, a huge study in 2005, a meta-analysis looked at 600, almost 700 studies. And what they found is contact with an out-group, bringing that group to you going to that group, can cause meaningful reductions in prejudice. And they looked at several areas of prejudice. And the statistical evidence supports that contact theory works. So it had significant positive results in terms of how people feel about sexual orientation, physically disabled, the elderly, mentally disabled, race and ethnicity, you name it. All of those studies, nearly 700 studies, proved that simple contact with other folks works. Something like this. You see, it's a very diverse group. Why does it work? For a couple of different reasons. When you have intergroup contact, it lowers the expectations that your contact with that out-group is going to be negative. It increases empathy for the out-group, so you're putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It reduces in-group favoritism, and you gain a greater knowledge about the out-group, and when you gain a greater knowledge, it just naturally reduces the stereotypes. Another best practice is called stereotype replacement. Stereotype replacement is very simple. It's basically noticing your first reaction and having a better one. So, sometimes we may be driving down the street, we see a homeless person by the side of the road. What's the first stereotype that comes to mind when you see a homeless person?
Mental illness.
Mental illness. There's multiple. There's somebody who doesn't want to work, somebody who's just lazy. There's multiple stereotypes. But when you have stereotype replacement, what you want to do is catch yourself when you make those stereotype judgments, and you want to replace it with something else that's more positive. So when I used to see homeless people on the street, when they first really started proliferating, my first thought was they're lazy. And then I actually stopped and talked to some. And you'd be amazed what you learn when you talk to them. Now, some of them may be a little scary to talk to, but you get a diverse tapestry of people and personalities when you talk to homeless people. You find out some of them are just down on their luck, some of them have mental illness, some of them lost their job. It goes on and on and on. It has nothing, oftentimes it has nothing to do with they just want to be on the street. So empathy, putting yourself in another person's shoes, that's a huge component of perspective taking, which is very similar to replacement theory. So I want to read this sentence and I want you all to fill in your blank as if this is about you. How would it feel for someone to assume that you are blank just because of your blank? Put yourself in that position. How would you feel for someone to assume that you're blank just because of your blank? So, with perspective taking, there are three primary aspects to it. One is you're labeling something as stereotypical, and again, and often it can be unconscious, it hits you immediately. Doesn't mean you believe in the stereotype, it just means that you're aware of it. Two, you reflect on why it happened and how it could be prevented. And three, you replace that stereotype response with a non-stereotypical response. So perspective taking individualizes a person. And there was a study, to give you an example of this, in 2007, in a group of college students where there were two conditions. They were shown a picture, a portrait of an elderly man, just his face. And one group was told, I want you to write a story, a short story about the day in the life of this elderly man. The second group was told, I want you to write a short story about the day in the life of this elderly man, but the flip side of this is, I want you to pretend as if that elderly man is you. So the students went off, they wrote their stories, they came back. When they examined the stories from the students who were just told, write about this old guy, their story was full of stereotypes about the elderly. And we can imagine some of the stereotypes about the elderly. The students who wrote about the elderly man as if it was them was much different. It was very positive, it was a warm story, it had a happy ending, it was very creative, there were a lot of positive attributes that this elderly person had. This elderly person had a lot of support in their life. This elderly person had lived a great life, they had lived a meaningful life. Very, very different from those who weren't told to walk in this person's shoes. So it goes back to empathy. If you can feel, try to feel what someone else might be feeling. That woman from South Central who comes to court wearing a dress with her cut down to here, a short dress, got 5 or 6 kids. If you can take a look at, put yourself in her position, and not just look at her as a mother who just wants to have kids and is just out there partying all the time, but a mother who's struggling. If you can look at that person from Palmdale or Lancaster and say, this person's had a tough life. They grew up with parents who maybe were abusive themselves. They grew up in a very tough environment. They were poor. They struggled. They're doing the best that they can. If you put yourself in their shoes, if you take their perspective, you're much likely to reduce that labeling aspect and be more non-stereotypical. And a couple more slides. Finally, forming an if-then plan. So psychology has shown that if you have an if-then plan, you can really change stereotype beliefs. So an if-then plan is very similar to what I just mentioned. The if-then plan is if you decide that if I have a stereotype that comes to me immediately, and I know that I may act on that stereotype, or I may relate to that person based on that stereotype, then I need to change my way of dealing with this person. I need to change that stereotype to a non-stereotype. So it's very similar to the 2 examples I just gave. If you have a stereotype, then you replace it with another, and if you do that often enough, soon that those stereotypes can dissipate and you can see that person as just a person. And finally, the last slide, we want to think about people and exceptions to the rule. If we have a stereotype about someone and we want to replace that stereotype or lessen that stereotype, think about somebody who is an exception to the rule. Women, you may have a stereotype that women do not do well in math and science. Then you take a look at a woman like Sally Ride, the astronaut. There's a person who's an exception, according to the stereotype, is an exception to the rule. So you may change your beliefs and your attitudes and prejudices, stereotypes about women. So you can find many exceptions to the rule. If you can do that and find an exception to the rule, you can vastly change, greatly change your tendency to be stereotyping. And I think that can prove not only the work you do with your clients, but just through your daily life on a day-to-day basis. So that ends the presentation for today. Again, it was very quick. I hope that you were able to gain something from it. And I appreciate you all listening to me. Thank you very much.